Hello everyone, my name is Ella and I'd like to thank you for joining me for episode 6 of my podcast on the accountability gap in domestic violence. Now today I'm talking about two different groups of people. One of them is the elderly community and one is the disabled community. Now, both of these groups of people have very, very similar statistics around domestic violence, and they are far worse than anyone can imagine. They're far worse than able-bodied people, and we all should hang our head in shame that we have allowed and continue to allow our governments to treat these precious people as though they don't matter, as though they're expendable, because they are not. They are the most precious people within our communities. They are the most vulnerable people in our communities. And for us to turn our heads and pretend that we don't know that these two groups of people are so badly treated, it's just a shocking indictment of societies, governments, and each and every one of us when we deliberately turn our heads and pretend that their issues are someone else's issues to deal with, because governments right around the world are proving time and time again that they do not give a shit about these two communities, especially when it comes to any court cases or legal proceedings. There is no safeguards for them. No one believes them. They are ridiculed. They are ignored. They are pushed under the carpet. And it's just so disgraceful. I'd like to talk firstly about a personal friend of mine from the elderly community here in the UK, who became a very dear friend of mine, and she lived alone. She was 82 years old, sweet old lady, very kind, but very vulnerable. She had no one around her that she knew, no family close by. However, she did have a son who was around about 50 years old, and he chose to live overseas and leave her to fend for herself. And after meeting her and getting to know about her life, she opened up to me about the horrific way her son was treating her so that he could inherit her property and her money. Now, this son was already being taken care of financially. He owned 2 houses, 2 properties, and yet, because he knew his mother was a loving mother, he had her manipulated so badly that she did everything he told her to do without question. And it caused her physical pain, but worse than that, emotional pain. And I witnessed this. I witnessed this lovely old lady in tears telling me about the gaslighting, which she didn't call it gaslighting, but that's what it was, that her son was doing to her constantly. And she was too afraid to do anything about it. I don't think she even knew that she could do anything about it to stop it. But when I found out how bad the situation was, I offered to help her try and remove herself from the situation by contacting either the medical fraternity or social workers, but she was too scared. And as hard as I tried, I could not get her to even give me permission to contact her local doctor or anyone about the situation she was living in. Now, she lived in a small one-bedroom flat that had brand new appliances in it when she bought the flat, and her son insisted that she not use the dishwasher, not use the washing machine, not use the heating, not use any appliances within the flat that were new. Because when she died, he could sell the flat, and if the appliances were all new, he told her he would get more money for the flat, and she believed him. I don't think he realised, though, that she would live another 10 years from the date that she moved into that flat. And I think I met her when she'd been there about 2 or 3 years at that stage. And she welcomed me into her life and into her flat, and straight away I could smell this terrible odour that was coming from her and her flat, because she had no washing machine. Well, she did, but she wasn't able to use it. And that meant that she would wear a particular item of clothing for so long until it literally disintegrated, and then she would go and purchase a replica clothing item to wear and start the cycle all over again. And it wasn't only her clothing, but it was her bedding, it was her dignity. It was just so sad. And it was also the way she prepared her food. She wasn't allowed to use the stove, so she could use the microwave, but it was just, I've never seen anything like it. And I felt so bad for her. And there were days where she was really quite strong and it didn't get her down too much, but the majority of the time she was very, very, very hurt and very sad. And it's just an example of horrific abuse that the elderly people suffer from behind closed doors. And the perpetrators are usually family members. If they live in a care home, it will be their carer. And these perpetrators are committing horrendous crimes and getting away with these crimes because there is no accountability. The lack of accountability in these two groups of people is just staggering. It's unbelievable. And it's something that has been going on for so long. Governments have been hiding, like deliberately hiding and manipulating statistics to sort of say it's not really that serious of an issue. But the numbers are really frightening. And I mean, for able-bodied people in a domestic violence situation, very rarely do they report the crimes. But when they do, there is a slight chance that the perpetrator might be held slightly accountable. And able-bodied people, such as myself, when we're in a domestic violence situation, we do have more ability to get help. We have more ability to go to a refuge or a shelter. But the elderly and the disabled, there's nowhere for them to go. Even if they wanted to, even if they could escape, there is nowhere for them to go. And I think I know the perpetrators, they count on this. They count on the fear that they instill in these vulnerable people. And they know they'll never be held accountable for the crimes. And all my research has proven that fact, that they do not ever get charged with anything. There is very, very rarely any reports of these crimes being committed. And I was reading an article from the UK government about a survey that is put out. I think it was by the service group called Safe Lives. I could be wrong there, but I think that's the group that was in charge of this survey. And it says, I think it was a very honest and very fair survey that pointed to some horrific numbers that governments, successive governments of all persuasions, did not want to be public knowledge. They could not accept the truth about the statistics, about the survey, what the survey said. But one of the most outstanding, horrific stats from that survey was that 98% of reported domestic violence against these two groups were dismissed. 98% of the reports were dismissed. And of the other 2%, they were thrown out before any legal procedures took place. So basically there was zero accountability for any of these perpetrators. Now the survey, this was really something quite disturbing that I read, and I'm still not really over the shock of reading about this survey. In, I think it was around 2015 or 2016, the surveys for these groups of people did seem to be quite fair, as I just mentioned. But then around 2020, 2018, the surveys, well, the whole system actually was changed. And I personally think it was changed because the numbers were so staggering that if those statistics got out to the public and became common knowledge, there would have been an outcry. Well, I hope there would have been an outcry. But what happened was the whole system changed from being a criminal type investigation when these crimes occurred to being a care home situation. So when the whole system changed from governmental care for these groups to private enterprises and private care facilities, the government could wipe their hands of the legal issues surrounding these crimes, and they passed the legal responsibility on to these private groups, these care homes, these care services. And strangely enough, I mean, I'm not a legal expert. I don't know anything about legal issues, really. But I do know this, that once the system was changed, the government had no legal responsibility for what happened to these people. They placed all of that in these care facilities. However, these care facilities, when crimes like this occurred to their clients, they didn't even call the police. They didn't report it to the police because it was not a police issue anymore. It was all supposedly going to be corrected and looked at through that organisation. So, are you kidding me? What the actual... So basically that is saying the government won't be held responsible for these groups. The care homes, they certainly are not going to take responsibility. If there was, say, a rape or some other beating or even a death with one of their clients, they would be the ones to say how it happened, why it happened, etc., etc., and supposedly hold the perpetrators accountable. Yet that didn't happen. That doesn't happen. It still doesn't happen today. So no one wants to take legal responsibility for these groups of vulnerable, precious people. The new government policies that have been discussed in the last few years here in the UK, I'm not sure whether it's a cost-saving measure or what really, but from my understanding, what they are doing is passing the buck. They have set up new services, these private services, and as I said, they seem to really want to wash their hands of any criminal behaviours from perpetrators on these people, because the cases are complex. But governments need to get their act together and work through that. That's not the victim's fault. It's the court's fault, and it's the police's fault, and it's the government's fault. So there's this new system called By and For, and apparently it is run by people with disabilities, and it's for people with disabilities. And the governments have made it look great on paper and in theory. Yet, if you think about it, how are people, especially with intellectual disabilities, how are they supposed to navigate the complex medical and legal systems that are often needed when a victim is harmed? I think it's extremely difficult for able-bodied people to navigate the systems. Well, it's near on impossible. So these systems look great in theory. You know, the governments are saying, yes, it gives the disabled community autonomy. But, you know, just think about it. They need their autonomy, yes. But in situations, especially legal situations and medical situations, they need specialist, intensive, high-quality legal and medical care. And that is not available. That costs money, and this By and For system are saying that there's just no money for that, let alone there's no expertise around these issues, so they're caught in the middle. When a domestic abuse situation occurs and police do become involved, they immediately pass the buck over to these care associations, and then they don't have the funds or the expertise to deal with the situation, so they then pass the buck on to other community services who also don't have the funds to, hire expert medical and legal people to help them. So it just goes round and round in circles. So these victims are left in limbo, getting no help, feeling so traumatised, so confused, and What, the government thinks that that's okay? I'm going to remind listeners here that when I am discussing statistics that I have read about that relate to the disabled community, these also relate to the elderly community. They mirror each other, these two groups of vulnerable people, and as far as care, concern, responsibility and accountability for domestic violence crimes, or lack thereof, both of these groups are in the same situation where no authority seems to want to take care of them or take responsibility for them or really help them. Now, between 2019 and 2026, this is the time period when the government starts to change its focus and move these communities away from them and into private situations or council situations. And one of the ways that they justified these changes was the method of recording the statistics of these two groups of people. Now, apparently, the prevalence of domestic violence cases in 2019 was 14.3%, and then in 2026 it had dropped to 9.2%. That was the number of people supposedly reporting domestic violence crimes from these two groups. However, and this is what I find immoral and unethical and cruel, because what they did with the statistics and the surveys is they changed the survey questions to suit the outcomes that they were looking for. They tightened definitions from within the survey, and they altered sample sizes. So in reality, there was not a drop in numbers of people being domestically abused in these communities at all. Seriously, I mean, who does that to these vulnerable people? I just find it so immoral. The survey also deliberately chose not to include in the official database people living in institutional care or supported living or medical facilities. So those three groups of people were excluded in the numbers, and those three groups are the groups that have the most people that are being domestically abused. So they've just changed the system and changed everything to suit the outcomes of what they wanted. But it's not reality, it's not truth, and it's despicable. I mean, for example, the disabled community in the UK makes up a massive share of the domestic abuse victims. A massive share. I don't have the exact statistics on that, but I know it's a huge number. And yet, in the Safe Lives surveys, they note that Their data shows only 3.9% of official safeguarding referrals are for disabled victims. So that doesn't balance the books at all. Actually, I've just come across an article that I do have stating that the numbers in the UK of high-risk domestic abuse victims from the disabled community is roughly 16,000 high-risk disabled victims in the UK, and roughly 13,600 are entirely missed by the whole system in bringing cases forward. Now, if this system does not identify the victims, it can't track or investigate or prosecute the abusers. In 2014, the CARE Act from the UK introduced a legal statutory framework requiring local authority social workers to step in and safeguard vulnerable adults. Sounds good, but the reality is very different. Safe Lives national data found that across 925 analysed referrals of disabled victims into specialist domestic abuse services, 0% came from adult safeguarding services. 0%. Now, social services routinely treat domestic violence inside a disabled person's home as a care package issue or carer burnout rather than a criminal assault. Once again, shifting the response from criminal to social care mediation. There's no justice, there's only what they call mediation. In other words, it means nothing, there's nothing. Now, talking about elderly people specifically here for a moment, most of the horrific crimes concerning domestic violence against the elderly come from their family members or their carers. And some of the reasons behind, like I just can't understand how family members can do that to their parents, but if there is a neighbour or friend that suspects abuse is happening to an elderly person and they contact the police, then the police, have the duty to at least start to investigate that. So they would go to the elderly person's residence, question not the victim, but the perpetrator, and the perpetrator, who is a scumbag, will have heaps of excuses as to why he did what he did, and please feel sorry for me because as a carer, I'm so burnt out, I'm so stressed. It's a very hard job looking after my grandmother, grandfather. So, please feel sorry for me. That's not going to work. But sadly, that does work most of the time. And police often fall for that. I mean, come on, seriously. And then there's also the excuse of, I had to lock them in their room because, they're crazy and they would have hurt themselves out here, in the lounge room or out in the yard, and I couldn't take them out in the car because, they're really crazy, they're angry, they're thrashing about. So I had to lock them in their room to keep them safe. That's another bullshit excuse. And anyone who's supposed to be a professional law enforcement agent or social worker, anyone that believes that shit deserves to lose their job immediately. But so many of these so-called professionals that believe the perpetrators over the victims, it's just unbelievable. And most times the victims don't even get questioned. They don't even hear the victims' stories or try to listen and try to understand the victims. I mean, if they can't understand what the victim is saying, they immediately call in a specialist to help them. There's no excuse for this crap about believing the carer burnout excuse or the it was for their own good excuse. I mean, come on. Seriously. I've heard so many stories about this type of situation, and I just hate the way the perpetrators take the vulnerability of these groups of people, especially disabled people, who sometimes can't articulate, they can't even think straight about the trauma that they've been through. All they know and all they fear is pain and fear and confusion. And if they try to report that to anyone, having their opinions and their feelings dismissed because they can't articulate things properly, and there is definitely an institutional bias against both these vulnerable communities in domestic violence crimes and other crimes as well. And I have a beautiful, loving nephew who I absolutely adore, and he was put in this exact situation many years ago. This was in Australia. Domestic violence crimes were committed against him. He was made to be very fearful about saying anything, but eventually it came out. And his parent contacted the police about this, and the police's response was, well, no one's going to believe him. So basically they did nothing. They wiped their hands of it. And that criminal scumbag perpetrator goes free. He goes on to commit these crimes against other vulnerable people. Now, that was many years ago in Australia, but just reading the current information, and again, this is in the UK, but I'm sure the statistics are similar in Australia. It was this witness credibility and the institutional bias that has come to the forefront of how police and the judicial system responds to these allegations. They're not investigated thoroughly. And if an abuser successfully convinces the investigators that the victim is confused or unreliable due to cognitive problems, well, the Crown Prosecution Service, the CPS, they will drop the charges immediately. And these are not my words. These are quotes from the law firm Baker McKenzie here in the UK. It states that the CPS requires a realistic prospect of conviction before going to trial. And you've got the abuser on one hand easily convincing the opposite side that they're the victim. I'm just going to read out to the listeners some of the tactics that the violent perpetrators of domestic abuse towards these two groups of people, this is some of the tactics that they inflict on these beautiful, precious people. Absolutely horrendous. I'm going to read straight from this document because you'll find that these are just not only deeply upsetting to the listener, but can you imagine what the victims go through? It's just so deeply sad. Now I'm just going to read through the list. The perpetrators' tactics can be, and usually are, assistive device hostage taking. So that means the abusers withhold or break vital equipment like wheelchairs, walking frames, hearing aids, or prosthetics to physically trap the victim inside their home. Medication manipulation, withholding life-saving prescriptions, intentionally over-medicating the victims to keep them sedated, or hiding medications to induce panic and dependence on the carer. The unreliable witness gaslighting. Abusers exploit cognitive decline, example, dementia, or speech impairments, by telling the police or social workers that the victim is confused, hallucinating, or making up stories. Another one is hygiene and care neglect, forcing a highly dependent person to sit in their own waste, withholding food or water, or refusing to help them with their daily needs. Now, that's, just let that sink in for a moment. This is what some of them go through. Now, the Welsh Women's Aid Organisation said that disabled survivors report that police officers and medical professionals frequently treat them as lacking credibility. This is what I just mentioned previously. And if a victim has a learning disability or brain injury or speech impairment, the abuser is often interviewed as the interpreter or a witness, when in fact they are the perpetrator, they are the criminals. And the impact of this on accountability means that criminal cases are closed prematurely before reaching the CPS because officers assume a disabled witness will not hold up in court or withstand cross-examination. You know, this whole subject and the research that I've carried out, and honestly I have hundreds of documents here, and it all points to the facts that we as a society do not place great importance on disabled people or the elderly when it comes to domestic violence crimes and other crimes as well. What are we doing as a community when we don't care about these people? You know, we've become a soulless, heartless, selfish, self-centred, greedy, money-hungry society. I'm talking here about people that are in the situation of helping these people. And yes, I think every single one of us has responsibility to these people as well. And when I look back on my situation with my dear friend, my elderly friend, I really wish that I would have just gone against her wishes and rung the police or contacted her doctor. But that would have made her so distraught. I don't know whether she would have emotionally recovered from that, but I really feel I should have done something. I'm just not sure how I could have held her son accountable for any of that, because he was the perpetrator. He was the disgraceful human being. Well, to me, he's not human. He's just a scumbag. But nothing I said would help her see that. Nothing would help her turn on her son. But yeah, it was a really terrible situation. But I do look back on it and think I did not do enough. I think I should have done something better for her. But, you know, it puts these victims in such a terrible situation. Exactly like my friend. It's just so sad. Looking at these statistics from other countries, it gives you a very clear picture that none of us are innocent. We have a terrible, terrible situation that governments have created. I mean, it's very hard for just the public, the general public, to really know what goes on behind closed doors when they're making policy decisions and budget decisions, all we get is the end result. And yes, quite often groups and organisations will be critical of aspects of budgets and policies, and they will say so, and a lot of people will talk about this and say it needs to change, etc., but it doesn't really change. Like, I can't see any real change that is a positive for the survivors, for the victims. And the way they manipulate and change the survey questions and the funding and the truth about what's going on with these communities, it's immoral, unethical, and cruel. And I think every person needs to, I don't know, maybe contact their council or their government or something, but I just can't sit by and just allow these sort of statistics to just float by me and do nothing. So I have sent emails off to certain members of government here in the UK, and regardless of whether I ever hear back from them or not, I have to do something. I can't just in all conscience just know these statistics, know what's going on and say nothing. That would be such a disservice to not only my dear relative in Australia that suffered greatly from domestic violence, but also my good friend here in the UK, but it's also a disservice to all disabled and elderly domestic violence sufferers. Just to make one point clear, this is about my beautiful relative in Australia. The domestic violence he suffered that I am talking about was perpetrated on him by a carer. So I just wanted to point that out because that was an important distinction there to be made. But, regardless of that, there are, thousands and thousands of these beautiful souls that are just suffering. Well, talking about Australia for a minute, I was just reading that there is the New South Wales Law Enforcement Conduct Commission, God, that's a mouthful, or the Victorian Independent Broad-Based Anti-Corruption Commission, oh God, and they're supposed to investigate police misconduct, including systemic discrimination and failures to investigate reports from vulnerable citizens. Yeah. That does not seem to be happening. They also have an organisation there, IDRS, Intellectual Disability Rights Services, which offer criminal justice support networks. They have another organisation for people with disabilities called the NDIS, and that I just was interested in that because I have a little knowledge about the NDIS. But before I just talk about that, I just want to run some numbers by the listeners, because unless we talk about numbers and percentages, raw, true data, we can't really grasp the magnitude of the problem. But this data that I have is Australian data, and it's from between 2019 to 2026. And what have we got? 562,000 elderly Australians experienced abuse annually. That was the 2019 stat. And in 2026, we have a number of 680,000 elderly Australians experiencing abuse annually. And just please remember that these are the statistics that they know of. A lot of people, elderly people, would not have been included in those statistics, I'm sure. But getting back to the NDIS for a moment, I believe that it is quite successful in looking after disabled people's, just their normal daily life and care packages for them, etc., etc. But they also have a responsibility to react and respond to their clients, the disabled community. They have a legal responsibility to protect these people that are under their care/service. And I was just looking at some data. I think this is the current report card, in inverted commas, of the NDIS in regards to domestic violence situation. And there's 3 areas that were looked at in this report card, and the NDIS is failing all 3 areas. The first area was systemic visibility. Apparently, according to this report card, it says they are failing. Complaints for domestic abuse have nearly doubled per capita. The second area was reporting safely. It says they failed in that. 57% of survivors completely avoid reporting due to systemic dismissal of their claims. So that's them not believing them. And the third area was emergency agility. And apparently they failed in that as well. And the comment was, because of rigid planning cycles, victims are locked into abuse care structures. And I think that's something that I read quite a lot on, and it was mainly sort of describing the fact that if you're under their care packages, very, very rigid time, locked in sort of schedules. Like if you were one of their clients and you were being abused, even if you had the strength to go to them and report it, apparently the time between that report and the time you actually got some real assistance can be at least a few weeks to a few months. So that leaves the victim where? Back with the perpetrator? Yes, because there's nowhere else for that victim to go. And, there's no refuges or shelters, as I said before. So that is definitely a big fail on their part. And a lot of the domestic violence that happens to the disability community that are receiving care packages, and they're still living at home, so that means they're carers, in inverted commas, are family members. Many of them who are abused, what do they do? Like, very unlikely they're going to report anything because the pressure on them from the family, for the family to actually keep the funding from NDIS must be incredible. And as I mentioned before, some of the horrific ways that carers and family members manipulate the disabled and the elderly into keeping quiet, not saying anything, so that they can keep the funding that's given to them that's part of the horrendous mindset of these scumbags. It's just totally out of control. And as I said, these statistics are similar in every country in the world. It's not just a random sort of statistic about Australia and the UK. But talking about UK again, I was interested to see all the different types of disabilities, and was there a particular type of disability where the victim was more abused than, say, a different type of disability? And there actually was, to my horror. But again, we're looking at 2019 to 2026. And I'll just go through a few of these different types of abuse. We've got psychological abuse, 2019, estimated annual victims, 444,000. 2026, estimated annual victims, 538,000. So we've got a net increase there of 94,000 for psychological abuse. Neglect, 2019, 110,000. 2026, 133,000. Net increase of 23,000. Then we've got financial abuse, 2019, 79,000. 2026, 96,000. Net increase of 17,000. Physical abuse, 2019, 68,000. 2026, 82,000. net increase of 14,000. Sexual abuse, 26,000, 2019 number, and 2026 number, 32,000. So net increase of 6,000. And as I say time and time again, these numbers here are just horrific, but never forget that most victims don't report the horrendous crimes perpetrated against them. You know, I'm just wondering, and I'm just going to put this question out into the universe. When are we going to have governments that really, really care about the well-being of disabled people and the elderly and vulnerable people in general? I mean, domestic violence crimes, they are at epidemic proportions. You know, we have an epidemic with COVID, and then the whole world joins together to find how can we eradicate this disease. Well, how about we use that same energy and the same resources to eradicate domestic violence from every sector of the community? Able-bodied people, and especially the most vulnerable, the disabled and the elderly. How about we join forces with other countries around the world and, you know, if we can find money to, you know, eradicate COVID, well, surely we can find money to eradicate this epidemic, this scourge of the worst possible kind. I can't emphasize that enough, how vile and violent these perpetrators are, and how most of them on every country are getting away with it. That's nearly as bad as the actual crimes that are committed. And before I go, I want to just mention one case of the most horrific domestic violence against an elderly person that I've heard of in my lifetime, and that is of the beautiful French woman, Giselle Pellicot, whose husband sexually abused her for over 10 years. I won't go into the details of the crimes. They're available for anyone to find on Google. But what a brave woman she was to come forward and to pull the curtain back at what is happening to vulnerable people. She was just so brave, and reading the sentencing of perpetrators after the crime, the sentencing was absolutely appalling. I think her husband got 20 years, and the hundreds and hundreds of other men who abused her, some of them got no prison time, and I believe the majority of those perpetrators got pathetically minimal sentences of between 4 and 6 years for the horrific treatment that they inflicted on that poor woman. So France, hang your head in shame. Disgraceful, disgusting. But, she is such a hero, such a brave woman for standing up and telling us the truth, lifting the veil of secrecy and showing us what does happen behind closed doors and what does happen in the legal system. And on both of those fronts, it's beyond disgraceful. So, we need to all pressure our governments to do something so much more than what they're doing now to eradicate domestic violence. And on that note, I'm going to sign off for this episode. And I know this episode is quite heavy and could be triggering to listeners. So please, if you are triggered by any of the information that I've shared, please stop and just give yourself a break and return to the podcast if you see fit. But thank you all for listening, and take care, and I will talk to you next week.